discussion about keeping the dialogue there. And that continued in the early 90s, but it's really just, they haven't been able to solve the disputes over territorial disputes directly, as we've seen flare up earlier this year. Still concerns about China's close ties to Pakistan and the kind of military assistance that China provides Pakistan, which can definitely be seen as defensive, not defensive. There's concerns about China maneuvering to surround India by picking off partnerships all around the country. And this is, I think there's just that relationship's going to get worse before it gets better. And this is going to complicate the Russia-China interaction. Just as China allied with Pakistan to counter India, so at least in the Cold War, Moscow allied with India to balance China. And this was most clear in the 71 war when, thanks to the signing of the 1971 Russia-India 20-year partnership treaty, it, I think, gave India the green light it needed to occupy East Pakistan and separate that into Bangladesh. The Russians, though, have strived, particularly under Yevgeny Primakov, the foreign minister from 96 to 98, and then he was prime minister for another year, to build this strategic triangle linking China and India with Russia. And it was clearly an effort to build some kind of not bloc that might oppose the United States, but just a counterpoising bloc, something that would support Russia's preference for multipolar world. And there was potential in that partnership. They agreed on important state sovereignty and countering some Islamic terrorism in Chechnya, Kashmir, and separatism in Taiwan, and so on. But it just never came to fruition. And even recently, when we saw Russia and China compromise to bring India into the full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in return for getting Pakistan in, it really looked like a pretty small measure, given they haven't been able to resolve the more serious differences over the free trade agreement or India's aspirations for UN permanent membership in the Security Council and so on. And this is, I just don't see any way that kind of triangle will be able to manifest itself going forward. I suspect, if anything, the Chinese will start pressuring the Russians more to weaken their security ties with India, particularly the joint development of some of the weapon systems which India might use in a war with China. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the Russians have been moving closer to Pakistan, and this is providing a means by which Russia and China are addressing Pakistan, Afghanistan, other areas with not, in my view, not much concern for India's views or input from Indian views. So what does this all mean for people here in the United States? I think it gives the U.S. a more complicated playing field, but also one with a lot of opportunities for good diplomacy, good leadership. India has clearly set aside its desire to be seen as a non-aligned and regional player, as global aspirations. It's been more comfortable working with the U.S. on global security issues, as well as binational security questions. There's been a surge, as we know, in U.S. military sales, a lot more bilateral, binational military exercises. There has been the signing of the foundational agreements, including earlier this year, the elevation of India's status to almost a non-NATO ally, giving India, basically treating India like it is if it were a NATO partner with a couple minor differences. Still, some concerns over sovereignty. I think we saw a lot of concern initially over signing some of these agreements that just allowed for exchanges of sensitive intelligence and data sharing about Indians, to protect Indian sovereignty. Also concerned about not sacrificing ties with Russia to move closer to the U.S. Some tensions over Russian arms sales, particularly the S-400, and how that U.S. sanctions might apply. Some concerns over U.S. policy towards Iran and how that might affect India's oil imports from and some disputes also over binational trade. But I think the joint interests the two countries have particularly in India in managing China's rise has sort of outweighed that and overcome a lot of the hesitations. And I think that over time, the U.S. will continue to carve out a more important role as an Indian defense supplier if we can buffer, which I think we can, the S-400 problem, and make somewhat. I think we need to make more progress on some of the private sector defense industrial cooperation that we've worked with. And so looking ahead to the next administration, I think that the designation of what had been the Asia pivot under the Obama administration, now known as the Indo-Pacific focus, will persist. I think that India is seen as invariably important player in what the U.S. will do anywhere in the Pacific. I think that the hyphenation of India-Pakistan won't come back under the Biden administration. I think that we're going to see an effort to build on the basic exchange and cooperation agreement and some of the earlier, the General Security Military Information Agreement. These are better known by their initiatives as Bekan, Jusomia, and so on. I think we now that we have the foundational agreements, this and next administration will focus on operationalizing them more and figuring out precisely how to apply them to the mutual benefit. There's still some, I think they're going to need to focus on the fast track projects that we're supposed to help through the industrial security annex of the recent military agreement. There's still, it's been a lot of talk and paper about, helping India develop a launcher for planes from aircraft carrier and some other advanced technology, but it hasn't really progressed anymore beyond discussion. So they're really going to need to step up and get the pilot projects to working better. I think that the effort to deal with Pakistani terrorism in Afghanistan may lose a bit of emphasis as the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan. Not really clear what the new administration will do in terms of how long it will stay in Afghanistan, what the new commitment would be, whether it'll try and improve relations with Pakistan. I haven't seen anything that might indicate that. So the key, I guess, though, the main issue that's puzzled us is President Trump and Prime Minister Modi had a very good personal relationship, and I think that overcame some of the concerns over visas and trade and some mistreatment of Indians in the U.S. And basically it helped manage the frictions. I don't know if that will hold true with Biden. He seems to get along well with people, and I'm sure he'll have a decent relationship with whoever's running India, but I don't think it'll be as close a relationship. I don't think that's necessary anymore. I think the relationship has expanded and become deep enough and wide enough that it will be able to buffer, persist, even if the India policy in the U.S. is basically driven by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense rather than the White House. But that's still something we're going to need to watch. And then there are a couple new areas that I think that we're going to need to push them to deal with. Besides what I mentioned, space and cyber in particular. I think that we've seen India emerge as a space power now with the shooting down of the satellite earlier, and a lot of concern about Chinese cyber. And I think the U.S. and India are going to cooperate more in dealing with Chinese apps and their implications. But as we know, President Trump is particularly interested in space and cyber. I'm not sure if the new Biden administration will be, so it's something we're also going to need to watch. So those are my general comments, that I think Russia's been fading overall as a partner to India, but it's not an antagonistic relationship. It's just Russia a little less relevant for what India needs. The China-India relationship is going to continue to remain bad. I don't think it'll go back to the, I think we might see military outbreaks periodically, but I think it will stay below the level of all-out war. But China will certainly continue to help Pakistan build up its own forces. And the U.S., I think that we've seen a lot of progress over both Republican and Democratic administrations. There's still some things we need to do, but I think that the new administration will continue to deepen this partnership. And I think the Indian government will also see the U.S. as a good partner going forward. But I'm eager to hear additional or ideas that differ from mine. People have their own assessments. So why don't we go ahead and move to that phase?
That was a very informative presentation, sir. Now I'd like to move on to the question answer session. And I request the host to please send me the questions that we have received. Okay. So, sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, go ahead.
So the first question we have received is, we have seen the Trump administration recently sent its Health and Human Services Secretary to Taiwan for a high-level meeting. While it was in the background of its tensions with China, would there be any foreseeable development in the official recognition of Taiwan by the international community? This is the question.
Right. So I think that the Trump administration has been leaning forward on cooperation with India, both as with Taiwan in several respects. So they've been selling more advanced weapons to Taiwan. They've been selling them more frequently, announcing more and more deals. We've seen, as mentioned, the high-level military and civilian officials go to Taiwan, and we're seeing a lot more openly, more visibility in this partnership. I don't think you'll see formal recognition. It's a bit strange because the U.S. is lobbying those dozen countries that still recognize Taiwan not to switch to the People's Republic of China, but it itself won't do so. And I think that when the Biden people come in, they may not be as pushing the envelope, if you will, with Taiwan as the Trump team has done. Trump's view with China is that the relationship's so terrible on all sorts of issues. It doesn't really matter. There's no cost to the U.S. from helping Taiwan since we're already in such, everything else is so bad. The Biden team, its approach to China, as far as I can tell, is going to be a little more mixed. Still a lot of concern on several economic issues, security issues, including Taiwan, but they want to balance it with some cooperation on the three topics I hear most are non-proliferation, climate change, and public health. And so this may be something that the administration will either curb back a bit, the working with Taiwan public health sector, or try to, if the Chinese want to make some concession, a good one would be to allow Taiwan again to start attending as an observer to the WHO and so on, just because they've done very effectively, more effectively than our own countries in managing the COVID pandemic. And so I think we can learn a lot from them. But no, no one I know plans to switch recognition to the Republic of China from the People's Republic of China anytime soon in the US.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is, what will be the implications of the peace deal being brokered by the US with the Taliban on India?
Yeah, not good, probably. So, but I mean, so I think, it'd be great if we get a peace deal that really works, right? That, ends the fighting, allows for the peaceful integration of the Taliban into Afghan society. But as far as everybody, and most people here just think they're playing the Vietnam playbook of just signing whatever the U.S. wants it to get the U.S. troops out, and then they're going to resume the offensive, and when knowing the U.S. won't come back in. I mean, the North Vietnamese did that quite effectively, and I suspect the Afghans do the same. The Taliban do the same. There are people in the U.S. who say, well, the Taliban's ambitions are regional. It doesn't matter so much the U.S. Al-Qaeda, ISIS are present in Somalia, a lot of African countries, a lot of Eastern countries. So it doesn't really need, Afghanistan isn't that special. It's counterbalanced. A lot of people are concerned about women's rights and so on. But I think in the end, the arguments just aren't strong enough to keep the U.S. there. And then interesting scenarios start to come into play. So if the U.S. withdraws, and what does Russia and China and the Central Asian countries do, and how India might play in that? So one scenario might be that the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, gets more involved in this in Afghanistan. And that would help India, since India has been elevated to full status of the organization. But so far, the SCO has not been very active in Afghanistan, and same with Russia's Collective Security Treaty Organization. Basically, they've been trying to set up a cordon sanitaire, a barrier in the north of Afghanistan to keep the country's problems out of Central Asia, rather than trying to address the problems in Afghanistan itself. It's possible that a U.S. NATO withdrawal will change that, but they could also just go back to their favorite strategy of supporting various proxies. The Russians like the Northern Alliance, some of the minorities, not the push, whereas the Chinese think they can just buy their way into peace, with prospects of investment and so on. But I think India, it's just not going to be very helpful. I think the Pakistani influence will rise. I think that might see more, basically a lot of India's investment and in terms of building ties with the population and economics are going to be less secure. This hopefully will be a topic of dialogue between India and the U.S., but I think will also be something that Indian diplomats will press pretty hard the Russians and maybe the Chinese to help them address as well.
Okay. So next question, will Russia or China be taking advantage of the transition period to the new administration?
It doesn't look like it. I mean, for now, it looks like the Chinese are just gonna wait out the end of Trump. There was a lot of fear a couple of weeks ago when Trump appeared to lose that he would blame China for his loss. I mean, that wouldn't be totally illogical in his train of thought, right? So he lost in his view because we went to all these mail-in ballots. The reason we went to all these mail-in ballots is because of the COVID pandemic. People like me didn't feel like spending hours standing in line just to vote when we could just mail it in and not have to take the risk. But the reason that we have the pandemic in his view, is because the People's Republic of China messed up the initial response, didn't contain the virus early on when it was possible to do so, allowed it to spread. And so in his logic, he could blame China for his defeat. And I think the Chinese were terrified that this, he just, that's what would happen. And so they've been playing very low key. In general, they tend to like to pick on weaker countries. So they've been picking on the Canadians because of, so for example, the Canadian US had a joint operation to seize the daughter of Huawei's founder because of her trying to help Iran get some privileged items. So what the Chinese did was they started grabbing Canadians and holding them in prison, getting into a fight with Canada, just because Canada is a weaker partner rather than confront the U.S. directly. Now we're seeing them go after Australia. They went after India earlier this year. They've tended to avoid confronting the U.S. Except in the economic realm. In the economic realm, they're happy to give as good as they get in terms of tariffs and so on. So I think that for the moment, though, they've not made, we've gotten some new measures against China by the Trump administration, banning certain companies from dealing with the U.S. government, making measures that are going to basically drive a lot of Indian companies out of the U.S. stock markets because they're not transparent enough. There is this new one, which a year ago would have sparked outrage of changing the visas of Communist Party members from 10 years to 1 month. I would say, though, that's all I ever get whenever I go to China. And they're supposed to give me a 10-year visa, but every time I go and apply for one, they give me one entry, one time. It's because they want to make sure you understand that your ability to come to China is on a short lease. So the U.S. is just being reciprocal. But in the past, that would have, I think, sparked a strong response. Same with the Taiwan things, but Taiwan U.S. activities. But I just think for now, they and the Iranians are just going to bide their time, be happy when he leaves, and then hope they can work something better out with the Biden administration, rather than get into a fight with him now, and then that limits what the Biden team can do when they come to office.
So, sir, as I can see, we have received quite a number of questions regarding Iran and Biden administration. So the question would be, what would be the Biden administration's policy towards Iran, and how will it affect India's policy towards Iran, as India has a strategic interest? Added to it, sir, I've read a lot about it, and the drone activities in that area by the US has increased manifolds. And like during the Obama administration, the drone activities were already too high. They were being criticized. But we see, as in the presidency, Trump presidency, the numbers manifold in the first year itself. So, sir, what's the future like? How is the Biden administration going to handle this?
Sure. So, whereas I think what's going to happen in Afghanistan will be bad for India, I think in terms of what's going to happen in Iran will be better. So as far as I understand, the Biden administration wants to work out a deal with Iran in which it will cease its major civilian nuclear activities in return for relaxation of U.S. sanctions. And it's those U.S. sanctions which are causing India and other countries problems. So I think India will be able to go back to buying oil from Iran in large amount, being able to send tourists there and have companies involved without worries of U.S. sanctions and so on. So that will be good. What we don't know is whether if they get a nuclear deal, whether this will deal with some of the many other issues that are a conflict, particularly the regional issues. So is Iran going to continue to try and force the U.S. out of Iraq? Is it going to continue to support groups the U.S. considers terrorists in Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and so on? What's going to happen in Afghanistan? In general, it should be better for India's commercial interests. Yeah, the drone policy was a Obama thing, as you mentioned. So the U.S. under the predecessor, George W. Bush, was sending hundreds of thousands of troops to invade countries. and that wasn't working very well. So the Obama team decided, okay, let's rely more on drones and other and special forces to deal with the terrorists. Trump administration, as you said, has continued that, and it's you're right. It's less talked about now than it was under Obama. One, because it was newer under Obama. That was just a new thing. Whereas, and Trump has also just been less transparent about what they've been doing. Biden, I don't know. If we don't have a lot of U.S. troops there, then either you work with the local partners, which is not easy in the case of the ISI in Pakistan or the Afghan security forces. So it's just easier to to take care of these problems yourself through special forces or drones and so on. So that may continue. What's new in the drone world is that U.S. isn't alone anymore. The Chinese have been developing a lot of drones, and we saw in the recent South Caucasus War, Turkey as well. But now everybody has them. So maybe I know some people are concerned now that when the U.S. had a monopoly, it could pretty much do what it wanted. But now it has to think about, well, if we send out drones to kill foreign nationals in foreign countries, does that mean China and Turkey can do the same? I mean, do we really want Chinese drones flying over Africa and Asia, attacking any target they feel like, because their definition of a terrorist is a lot different than ours. So I don't. That's something they're going to have to review. It's a good question. And there's no easy answer. But the laws on autonomous weapons and so on is just. I guess you guys know more about this than I do because you're studying law. It's being undeveloped, so it's something people are discussing.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the next question would be, what would be the Biden administration's approach towards Indian immigrants?
Yeah, well, considering they've nominated one to be head of the Office of Management and Budget, a very senior position. Considering the vice president is partly of Indian descent, I think it's going to be very positive. I mean, traditionally, Indian immigrants have done very well in the U.S. The income of the average Indian is higher, an Indian immigrant in the U.S. is higher than the average American. So in the past, the Muslims in the U.S. were actually better off than the typical American because of the South Asian Indians and were doing so well economically. We know under Trump, the Indians sort of got swept under his general anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim policy, and so Hindus and Muslims are sort of equated. But I think under Biden, certainly a lot of the anti-Muslim measures will be repealed, and so that will help Indians and Muslim descent as well as Pakistanis or others. And just in general, I think the immigration will be relaxed. I think will be expansion of student visas. I don't quite know what COVID impact is going to have. That's cut back on foreign students for everybody. And so I have a couple Indian interns now, but they're all remote, electronic, like everybody's. There's also a problem that the U.S. schools are really expensive, so they're going to have to figure out a way to make themselves more competitive. But you're right. The key question is everybody's looking at is Silicon Valley, and I think because of how close the tech companies are to the Democrats, I think they're going to be successfully keep open the opportunities for Indian entrepreneurs, Indian tech experts to come to the U.S. or work with U.S. companies. I think it's going to be harder to relax those restrictions on China. I think just Chinese nationals, because of the way that the government there uses their nationals in many cases to steal economic private information and so on. And do all sorts of other bad things that the FBI has labeled. It's going to be harder to use Chinese nationals now in U.S. high-tech sector. But I think Indians and other immigrants will be, there'll be more opportunities under the various specialized visas. I'm blanking on the number. I think it's like 12 something, 12B or 12(1)B, I forget, but there's some special visas that have been particularly valued by Indian entrepreneurs, Indian tech experts.
So the next question is, how has the pandemic affected the dynamics of the world powers? It's a very broad question, but
Yeah, right. So it has the most evident impact, which is kind of ironic, is it has accelerated China's rise. So the date when China will surpass the US having the largest economy has been accelerated because China, after suffering initially from the outbreak, has recovered better than anybody. It has, so I think it's enhanced China's influence and power economically. There is a bit of a counter in that China's popularity in the world has fallen a lot because many people, as I said, hold Chinese government responsible for messing up the response. There's also been a lot of other things going on, like Xinjiang and so on, that have undermined support for China. It has, I think, contributed to the loss of U.S. influence and respect in the world. I mean, all the studies before a year ago, if you looked at the studies that people were putting out, said the U.S. would have the best response to the pandemic because of it for various reasons. It's actually had, it's fallen. It's one of the worst, and so it's certainly fallen as a poor performer. A lot of weaknesses in American society have been exposed by the pandemic. The one thing it didn't do, which it might have, is it didn't affect the Russia-China relationship. So you would have thought that given what happened to China, that would have caused the Russians at least to think a little bit more seriously about relying so much on China. I mean, do they really want to put their eggs in China's economic basket so much, count so much on China to rescue their economy when we saw how the supply chains collapse and the Chinese slowdown? Now, of course, because China's recovered, that has actually had the opposite effect. I think the Russians are even more dependent now on China because that's really their own economy, and European economies and the US and so on are still suffering. So if the one country that can buy a lot of their goods, buy their energy, is China. So the pandemic has, I think, the effect of strengthening China in general and also strengthening Russia's support for China. How much, it's hard to break out the pandemic itself. Some of these factors were due to Trump and how his policies were being perceived internationally. We now have a new U.S. president. Will that change things? Will they go back to how they were? I don't know. But the main impact so far is the pandemic has helped China, which, as I said, is again ironic, given that their initial fumblings on how to respond.
Yes, sir. So the follow-up question would be on China itself. So you, in the presentation, you said China is maneuvering to surround India. So, sir, and also we know that the One Belt, One Road initiative is also in full-fledged development that China is pursuing. So, sir, and we also know that US is also putting or continuing to put unilateral sanctions also. So, sir, the question is it foreseeable that US will continue its unilateral sanctions against China that Trump was actively involved in promoting during his tenure?
Yeah, I think the Biden team has a different approach, that they're going to try more for multilateral efforts against China. So they want to work with other countries to force the Chinese to change their economic behavior. So I think there'll be opportunities and pressure on India to join in on addressing the China's economic bad behavior in terms of stealing secrets, cyber theft, and other issues. This could help India, but it will also mean it may also cause India to need to confront China economically more than the government in the past would like. But we do know, though, that the Indian government has banned a lot of Chinese apps recently and taken a harder line on some of these economic issues. So that seems to be their preference, that they want to work with Europe more, Japan, India, Australia, other countries to build a common front to require China to behave better economically, respect international standards more, rather than just go after China alone, sanction after sanction, measure after measure. So that's I think this will be a major difference from the Trump administration.
So the next question is, so you can please tell me if you're running short of time, if you feel like.
Not really. I mean, it's yeah.
Because
So
the questions are just pouring in. I can't help it, but there are a lot of questions pending also. I'm just filtering out the most pertinent ones.
Sure.
So the next question is, what would be the impact of the Biden administration on the bilateral relationship between US and Iraq?
US and
Iraq.
Yeah. Not clear. Biden has a history there so at one point under the Biden administration, he was calling for splitting Iraq into parts. There'd be a Kurdish part and a Sunni part and a Shiite part. That quickly was abandoned just because, I mean, you basically have something like you saw with the India-Pakistan split in 47, right? Because they live so close together. Baghdad's, intermixed. So it'd just be a mass population movements, a lot of fighting. So that was not supported. He also, though, presided over the U.S. troop withdrawal, which in retrospect may help ISIS rise, because without the U.S. troops, the Iraqi government wasn't able to maintain order. But there's not a lot of popular support for keeping a long mission in Iraq. The Iranians are continuing to put pressure on the U.S. to leave. So I don't know. That's one. We don't know what his Iraq policy will be. Whether they'll stay in troop-wise or not. Whether they'll try and interfere more in the political situation there against Iran, or decide it's better to try and work with Iran. That's one of the things we don't know at this point, what their policy will be.
So then the next question is also about China. Today, China exports more goods to the US than to any other country in the world. The US depends heavily on China for providing low-cost goods that enable income-constrained American consumers to make ends meet. How is the United States planning to get rid of its overdependence on China for cheaper and more economical goods? And how is Biden administration going to tackle this?
Right. So, yeah, this is one of the failures of the current administration. So the U.S. has become even more dependent on China in the last few years, despite Trump's policies. So I think the sanctions don't appear to be working all that well. So I think that the Biden administration will not rely on tariffs. So it won't rely on tariffs. They're just seen as not very effective. The costs are borne by the U.S. consumer, and so I think they're going to try more to not so much bring industries back the way Trump did. I mean, he seemed to be fixated on bringing like factory jobs back to the U.S. I think the Biden team looked more to leap over that and go for next generation. So have the U.S. take the lead in nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, renewable energies, and so on, and capture that market, and leave the industries and so on to other countries to take the lead on. But I mean, it's going to be tough. It really requires the U.S. economy to make some major changes and become more efficient. And they say they'll spend a lot of money doing this, but if the Republicans control Congress, they're going to block that, the Senate. And so I don't know to what extent they'll realize their goal. But it's not just the US. Everybody's suffering from overdependence on the Chinese economy. And we saw the vulnerability to the world in the beginning of this year when we lost those ties that sort of threw everybody into a setback.
So one of the last questions is, Turkey is emerging as a rival against Russia, as is evident from the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict and the Russia-Turkey proxy conflict in Libya and Syria. Turkey relations with India have also soured when it brought up Kashmir in the UN last year. How do you view the dynamics between these key nations?
Well, Turkey is just a big troublemaker, a big problem for everybody. So I mean, they've gotten into fights with the Europeans and particularly the French over lots of things, but particularly Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus. They've alarmed a lot of the Gulf countries by putting forces in Qatar, and then they're in a dispute with the Russians over South Caucasus, Syria, and Libya. They've lost a lot of Americans have just become very uncomfortable with India's behavior, buying the S-400s, for example, or what's happening inside India with the arrest of all these journalists, inside Turkey with the arrest of all these journalists, and so on. Trump had an okay relationship with Erdogan, but I don't think Biden will continue that. So Turkey is just out of control. It's been, I think, because of the lack of strong U.S. leadership in many of these questions, India sort of exploited this loophole. So the U.S. didn't intervene much to deal with Syria or Libya or Cyprus, so the Turks were sort of free to take a higher profile. Same with the South Caucasus, that the Russians sort of dropped the ball there, and so that just gave India another opportunity. But the Indians are clearly punching above their weight. I mean, it's not Turkey is not. I mean, Turkey's punching above its weight. Turkey is not a strong economy. Turkey has a limited military capacity. I just think they're just exploiting a lot of opportunities from poor leadership, and that may change. I think the Russians have become more concerned with Turkey because of how surprised they were what happened during the South Caucasus War. And I know that the Biden administration wants to take a higher profile on Syria, on Cyprus, and so on. So that may change, but so India shouldn't feel particularly in a special case. The Turks have attacked pretty much everybody over everything, and I think that just the President Erdogan seems to enjoy these kind of confrontations.
So probably the last question for today is, how will the Biden administration impact the crude oil trade between India and Iran, which was tanked by the Trump administration?
Right. I think that will allow that to continue. I think we'll also see opportunities for India and Iran to develop some of the ports and infrastructure projects that they discussed earlier. I think they'll be easier for Indians to work in Iran and vice versa. So I think economically it'll be much easier, just because I think the Biden team plans to roll back a lot of these sanctions as part of their effort to improve relations with Iran, and that will benefit India, at least economically.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for all these insightful answers. And I feel honored, and it is my privilege to get the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks on this special day. On behalf of the International Law and Policy Society and our university, and on my own behalf, I convey my regards and hearty thanks to our chief guest, Dr. Richard Weitz. I also like to thank all the attendees who blessed us with their presence. We are grateful to the university administration, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, the IT department, and our faculty advisor for helping us to organize this event. Last but not the least, I would also like to thank the organizing team and all the members of the International Law and Policy Society who put their last complete week in arranging this webinar.
And allow me to offer the same thanks to the same people as well as for you for doing such good as moderator. And let's try this again maybe a year from now when we do have a Biden policies we can talk about. And again, as I said, I hope to
Sure.
visit. I've never been to India. I was really excited to go, but I'll have to postpone it 1 year or whatever. Thanks. All right, take care. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye. For all the attendees, thank you for joining. I'd like to request you all to please join us on Instagram and Twitter, and keep in touch with us through our website www.ilpsnluo.com. That's it. Thank you for today. Thank you, sir.
I would request all the feedback form. Feedback